Thank you all for joining us this afternoon or this morning, wherever you are. Our main interest in IPPO is on really organizing knowledge and evidence, and speeding up the sharing of what's working, what isn't working, what looks plausible, what doesn't. And that's really the purpose of our session today. I would urge you to read Henriette's note if you haven't already. There's also a broader paper on the IPPO website looking at sort of sources of knowledge and evidence for net zero more broadly. And I think, and someone may correct me, I think we're at least a quarter of a century into cities having net zero strategies, for the fairly obvious reason that cities are where most emissions happen, to a degree at least, and therefore have to do the heavy lifting in decarbonisation strategies. We're going to hear a little bit from my colleague Basil to just share a bit of data for us, Basil Mahfouz, and then we'll hear from a series of speakers. But we've tried to leave half of our time nearly for discussion, for questions, and I hope digging into, in particular, what aspects of this whole field are easy, or at least relatively easy, and which ones are difficult, and where may be the biggest gaps between what we need to do and what we know. So Basil, over to you to kick us off.
Thank you very much, Professor. I'm assuming everyone can hear me? Great. Okay, so just a quick overview of how we're mapping the difference between research supply and research demand in the field of net zero. So in front of you, there's a map, for example, of all the net zero research that has come out of one city, Madrid, over the past 10 years. You can see we can cluster these and see certain areas of strength, and we can do these for multiple cities to try to compare areas of capabilities and specializations. We can also do these types of research looking at horizontal topics. So not just looking at a city, but also looking at certain subtopics within net zero. For example, with building efficiency, with energy efficiency in buildings, you can see the various subtopics and the various research produced per subtopic here. But more interesting, I think, is when we combine the two. So for example, this is research from 25 cities on buildings efficiency. And you can see kind of different clusters of research supply, some related to housing, some related to biotech, some related to cooling and ventilation, etc. On the flip side, we can look at research demand. So things that from this research made its way to policy. So for example, this is the overall, so the first layer of analysis is overall looking at the policy documents themselves. So you can see these are the topics that the policy documents on the buildings and net zero tend to focus on. But more interestingly, we can look at policy documents within cities. This is another map showing you kind of the keywords coming out of policy documents published by cities. And finally, we can do the same kind of clustered mapping, again, on which research papers on a certain topic ultimately get cited, and compare, for example, this map with the map you saw earlier to see kind of where the areas of strength are and aren't. So that's a quick presentation from my side. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Basil. And we will be publishing much more of this. These tools are ones which didn't really exist 5 or 10 years ago, both the systematic mapping of global research, not just formal research, but also grey literature, and the use of databases to map the policy field. And in some ways, what this shows is the extraordinary explosion of research on all aspects of net zero. But there is still a bit of a challenge in making that really useful and usable if you are a decision maker in a city, let alone maybe someone running a building or an electrician or a plumber. And we're trying to see how to get much more efficient these links between supply and demand. So now our first sort of speaker on the list, other than Basil, if I could turn to Camilla Hislop from Net Zero Tracker, which is an extraordinary project doing what it says on the tin. So Camilla, over to you.
Yes, as Jeff said, I'm Camilla. I'm from the Net Zero Tracker. I'm the data lead there. And today I'm just going to talk a little bit about the global trends that we're seeing in relation to cities and net zero. So as the name suggests, as Jeff said, we track the net zero commitments, both in terms of the quantity thereof, but also the quality. And I think the main takeaway that we've really felt is how this has spread across the global economy. So in July 2019, 16% of global GDP was covered by a national net zero target of some description. This morning, it's at 92%. And this wave of ambition at a national level has been reflected somewhat by other entities, and that's regions, cities, and companies. And the cities on our database, we have all cities of over 500,000 inhabitants, which equates to about 1,177, as you can see. And we found that just over 20% of those have a net zero target or a similar climate target of some description. And while this is quite hopeful in the sense that there is some momentum building, because this has increased from 15% in 2020, we do sometimes feel that maybe there is a lack of credibility within those net zero targets that already exist. So last year, we looked at the net zero targets of the entities that we have on the back end, and we try to compare them against the starting line criteria that comes from the United Nations Race to Zero campaign. And I'm sure most of you are very well aware of what this is, but for those of you who don't, that's the minimum criteria for joining the United Nations Race to Zero campaign. And at that stage, it was the 4 Ps. They've added persuade in the interim to make it 5 Ps, but we found that only 17% of cities that already had net zero targets met all 4 Ps. And then when you add in the leadership practice, which is including all territorial emissions and really doubling down on not using carbon offsets, only 2% of cities. And this is in comparison to 3% in regions and 5% of countries that are meeting those criteria. But of course, help is on its way, because the UN Secretary General set up his high-level expert group at COP26, looking at non-state entities, because as the chair of the H-Leg, Catherine McKenna, said, non-state actors, including cities, are critical. And they released their 10 recommendations at COP27. And so we try to map how cities are doing against these 10 recommendations. And I just want to share a bit about what we found. So as I said, just over 20% of cities have a net zero target, which when you compare against companies and regions, you see that they're not quite matching corporate ambition, but they are a bit ahead of how regions are doing, which is very encouraging. And what is also encouraging is that just over half of those that have a net zero target have an interim target. Interim targets are really critical for us to get to net zero by 2050. And in this sense, they are actually quite on par with corporates, but maybe a little bit less ambitious in regions. But where they really shine, and this is something where I think cities have a lot to talk about, is how they are incorporating justice and equity into their net zero targets. So you can see that they're doing much better than regions and companies in this respect, and are much more aware of how net zero has implications for all citizens, and are really including this in their net zero targets. And then just to close, because I'm aware that we're short on time, I think there are 2 key areas that where cities can really grow a little bit in terms of the net zero strategies, and that is reporting on progress. There definitely is progress in cities, which is just not really being reported, that we're seeing. And then also just this being a bit more clear and transparent about the use of external offsets. It's really a key fundamental tenet of net zero that we want to move away from using offsets, and it should be as a last resort. But cities aren't always that clear that they're going to do that. And just to say that you can fact check everything that I've done by downloading our data from the website. You can see the big red button, and I look forward to the rest of the presentations.
Thank you very much, Camilla. Just 2 very quick questions on fact. I may have missed that as you went through. How many cities are covered in this? You've got 2,000 companies. How many cities are we talking about?
Just over 1,000, so about 1,177.
That's cities with over 500,000 population. Yeah.
Exactly.
And is there a clear geographical pattern in terms of which have the targets, interim targets, etc.?
Yeah, there does seem to be a bit more ambition within the G7, just because of how it's fallen out, and it tends to line up with a little bit more ambition in national targets. But of course, as you yourself said, some places like Australia maybe do need to catch up a bit, but that tends to be the trend.
Yeah, I should say just before we started, I mentioned I was in Australia last week, which still has the worst record on carbon emissions, but is trying to get its act together after 10 years of stalling for political reasons. We're now going to turn to Troels Jacobsen, who is from the Technical Environment Committee of Copenhagen, which really is one of the star performers in this field and has been for many years, with ambitious plans on energy, on cycling and transport, on school food and so on, and quite ambitious both targets and implementation. So I hope, Troels, your technology is now working and we can both see and hear you if you are ready to join us.
Yeah, I guess Copenhagen is doing okay, but actually we have just admitted recently that we are not going to reach our targets for 2025, mainly because carbon capture didn't work out just yet. So for our district heating system, we still have to burn a lot of stuff that emits a lot of carbon dioxide, and we can't catch it. And I want to just take you a step further in this, because I think as a politician who's very green, I'm from the Green Party, the alternative in Denmark, and Copenhagen is blessed by having a political majority that is ambitious on this agenda. But when we come to the habits and the sunk cost, the systemic sunk cost in the existing systems, it's often difficult to be ambitious in action. We have a lot of money invested in old technology. Just recently, we had a debate in City Council about our bus system. If we want to spend some money on canceling contracts with buses run on fossil fuel. So that would cost us like 40-50 million Danish crowns to cancel those contracts to reach our targets. And this was the debate in City Council, if it was worth spending those money on canceling contracts. And we meet this again and again. And also as a city, we run into problem with the laws, the national framework. Right now, they want to make all waste management and make it more market-driven, which will damage a lot of the city-run systems and give the focus how to be profitable in terms of money and not so much in terms of the green profile. And this is some of the issues I think we're battling in achieving our ambitions.
Thank you, Troels. Or perhaps I could just ask you, I mean, we'll come on a bit later maybe to this question of the timescales of change, where energy infrastructures, transport systems are concerned. You cannot change quickly. These are 5, 10, 20-year programs of change. Am I right in thinking, though, that Denmark has responded perhaps even better than any other country in reducing energy use as a result of the Ukraine crisis? That was the claim I was being told a few months ago, that even before policy measures had been introduced, very dramatic reductions in use had been achieved. So some things can be done quickly in a crisis, even though other things maybe take time. Any comment on that?
Yes, and I think we were not that hit by the problem with the cheap Russian gas, but that was not so cheap anymore, we couldn't get. But we've been hit indirectly. And we were able to, because of district heating systems, for example, which are quite widespread, and more housing could be added to it, and also an ability to roll out, what do you call them, the electric varmepumper, heat pumps in Danish.
Yeah.
So that went quite well. But for example, the waste market, waste to burn for heating, changed because of this. So it has become more expensive. We are getting paid to take people's waste and burn it in Copenhagen. And it's probably good we burn it in Copenhagen because we do it in a way with limited pollution. We also had the ambition on having carbon capture but right now we can see in the waste market, it's become more difficult to get good quality waste that doesn't pollute as much.
Yeah, the whole issue of energy from waste and its politics is quite fraught in many cities. although I think much of the world envies your neighborhood, your district heating systems. We'll come back to some of the,
Yeah, but a really interesting thing that is happening on that front in Denmark now is that we are starting on geothermics as a new sustainable way of getting heat for the district heating systems.
You mean from the earth? This is like, from the underground heat.
Yeah.
Which in the long run may be our free source of heat, even if the capital costs are very high.
No, and what we need in our heat systems is about 10-15% of stable. I mean, one is wind and sun, we're not so sure about, but we need 10-15%, which is there all the time.
Yeah.
And geothermics could be that.
Yeah. Thank you, Troels. We were hoping to hear now from Ava Richardson from Baltimore, but I'm not sure if she's managed to get on the call. So unless you signal, Ava, you are ready and waiting, we will turn to Marika Abrahamsa from city of Rotterdam. And you are in charge of, well, you're in the Committee of Mobility, Port, Economy and Climate, which covers a lot of different aspects of this. So Marika, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. And a lot of things that Troels mentioned are quite the things that I recognize also as challenges or as issues that we discuss here in Rotterdam. Looking at the political spectrum, I'm a little bit more from the other end of the spectrum, but I think actually here in Rotterdam, we are in the governing coalition with some pro-car parties. But actually looking at our coalition agreement, we are actually quite ambitious, I would say, when it comes to net zero and making changes to make the city more sustainable. And I think part of it is probably because we're next to our own harbor, which has a lot of emissions, and despite apart from the effects on the world, that also has effect, of course, also on the health of our citizens. So looking at what we've been doing, and I agree with looking at the tracking, that the reporting actually hasn't been so well from our city. But looking at the reporting I got internally, we actually made 10,000 houses natural gas free. Also, all new homes are insulated and natural gas free. And our goal for 2025 is to have an additional of 350 megawatts of wind energy, as well as in 2026, 3.2 square kilometers of solar panels. And we've also developed in the previous coalition period a zero emission strategy for our transport sector. And now very recently, we've also agreed to start with shore power for especially cruise terminals, which will definitely inside the city also reduce CO2. But there are a couple of challenges. And I think it's slightly different from Denmark. For us, the grid capacity is one of the main challenges right now, and that's also in the harbor. What we see there is that both supply and demand of renewables is limited to get them onto the grid. So we're gonna have to invest a lot, maybe even massively, in our grid in order to have, for example, wind turbines that companies actually want to develop to be able to still get them on the grid, as well as new users who use a lot more electricity because they're going off fossil fuels. They may also not be able to connect to the grid because we don't have the capacity anymore. So especially looking at the harbor that use a lot of fossil fuels, that's a big challenge. So far in the city, it's not an issue yet. But yeah, we see all throughout the Netherlands that this is becoming an issue. And then the war of Ukraine has indeed had quite a positive effect when it comes to citizens becoming aware of having to make their houses more sustainable. We've had a lot of energy boxes. That's what they're called. Basically, they give very quick fixes for the homes. And we've divided them among citizens, and they were very popular, especially in low-income neighborhoods. But there we see that for the bigger changes, the war has actually also had a negative effect. And that's also because the actual products to make things more sustainable have either gone up in prices or are just less easy to produce. And what we also see is that we have quite a labor shortage, especially when it comes to the energy sector transition, energy transition sector. So, for example, people installing solar panels, it's more and more difficult to find them. And we see that there's a group of citizens who actually has established their own corporation where they want to create solar power, but they don't actually have a business case anymore because the panels have gone up in prices. So they might not even be able to afford it for a price for citizens. And I think there's one point that I personally believe a lot in that would help us a lot in becoming net zero in Rotterdam, and also help to kind of solve some of the grid capacity issues as well, some of the supply issues that we're facing. And that would be building a nuclear power plant in our harbor, because it will actually even out the solar and wind energy fluctuations. And the heat that we might that we use a lot, but we might have less of if the industry decreases in terms of the fossil fuels that they use. The heat from the nuclear power plant could actually help us heat the city.
Thank you very much, Marika. And we will maybe come later to this question of skills. In a way, everyone's been talking for several decades about the need to skill people up for installing solar panels and maintenance and the circular economy. And yet all over the world, we see skill shortages. Why has this happened? Why, and can we do better? And I will come back to all of you a bit later to talk about the balance in city strategies between, as well, your high emitting industries, which might include like shipping perhaps in Rotterdam, your own basic infrastructures of energy and transport, and then behavior change with the public. What's kind of the balance of those in terms of delivering the big reductions in the next 10, 15 years? But first, we're going to hear from David White from Bristol. For those of you who don't know the UK so well, Bristol is probably the greenest city in the country, both politically, perhaps culturally. Brighton maybe competes. And so very much a trailblazer in this space. David, over to you.
So I'm here to talk about Bristol City Leap, which is a model we've implemented in Bristol which is replicable, and other cities may be interested in what we're up to in terms of what it's going to do in helping Bristol to get to net zero. We've managed to reduce our emissions reasonably well over the last 20 years or so. So I think as a city, we're down by about 42%, and as a council, it's down by around 80% since 2005. Nonetheless, we still declared a climate emergency back in 2018 and set a goal for the city to be carbon neutral by 2030. I'm not sure if we appear in Camilla's numbers though, because I think we're just under 500,000. So you can add one more to the list if you brought that down very slightly. So we have declared a climate emergency back in 2018, and the 2030 target is in our corporate strategy, but obviously well ahead of national strategy, which presents its issues in itself, because government policy needs to play an important part in what we're doing. But if I'm honest, although the council's done extremely well in terms of its own delivery over the last sort of 10 or 15 years, we've put wind turbines up, we've invested in low carbon heat networks, solar PV, charging points for electric vehicles, 10,000 homes retrofitted, so on and so forth. It's nowhere near enough. It's nowhere near fast enough. And put simply, we have to substantially increase the pace if we're to meet our own carbon neutrality targets, to demonstrate leadership in Bristol, which is an important role for the council, and to address the climate emergency that we've declared. But how do we achieve that in the period of time we've got left, with the limited resources available to the council? So what we've done is something called City Leap, and that's a strategic approach to public-private partnership, and it's something we've procured and we implemented at the beginning of this year, the aim of which is to deliver £1 billion of investment in low carbon energy infrastructure over the next 20 years, with a lot of it up front. So yeah, City Leap is this new approach, an innovative approach to public-private sector partnership, covers all project types that you can put into the low carbon energy infrastructure arena, and it basically builds on the work that we've done to date and look to leverage that at a far faster pace than we can actually do it on our own. If we could have the next slide, please. And it all started with a very slim 30-page prospectus with lots of pretty pictures of Bristol and lots of white space, and basically said, if you're interested in coming and working with us on net zero, please let us know. We had 180 responses to that, and companies all the way from multinationals, financial institutions, energy companies, all the way down to small local small companies that are playing in the space. And we did meet with all of them to get their views, and that fed into the procurement that we subsequently ran for City Leap. Next slide, please. And what we've done is to let a 20-year concession to our partner, Amoresco, and that's to deliver and fund projects right across the council's estate. So that's what the concession relates to, via a joint venture company that we co-own with them. And that company essentially has the right of first refusal to deliver all low carbon energy projects on the council's estate, including its social housing. We never have to run as a council a procurement exercise ever again, which can take considerable time and effort. And it allows us to move away from we're going to do a project here and we're going to do a project there and one over here, and actually put them all together and do it strategically. And to give the market confidence that the council would proceed, we set a number of preset criteria for projects to be approved by the council, and provided that they are met, they will be approved. And that's a risk for the council. It's a bit outside the comfort zone, but we're in an emergency situation. So we feel that the balance that we've struck is appropriate and still protects the city from, in terms of value for money. There are checks in there to ensure that, but nonetheless, we do need to proceed at serious pace. And it's not just about the council estate either. It's about acting as a catalyst for net zero across Bristol. A good pipeline of work that the supply chain can see, and encourage the supply chain to gear up for what's coming in terms of the transition. Make sure the skills and training's in place, encourage school leavers to move into those careers. Next slide, please. So a number of key commitments that came through in the bid process. So minimum capital investment of 424 million and 60 million of social value in the next 5 years, and then up to £1 billion over the 20 years of the partnership, to make the council's operations carbon neutral by 2025. Same for our social housing, 27,000 properties by 2030, expand the heat network and make it carbon neutral by 2030. And then contribute to Bristol's decarbonisation. It's really important. It's not just about the council. Next slide, please. So I've mentioned the spend with Bristol businesses. We expect 1,000 jobs to be created, and to encourage those training and apprenticeships and school and college visits. We're going to have a new community energy fund, because we think it's a really important factor in City Leap, that it's not just about doing decarbonisation to the city. It has to be something that everybody comes along on, and certainly as part of a just transition, it's really important that the community is involved and engaged in that process. So we hope that will be part of that answer, but there are a lot of other activities going on around that space to make sure that happens. I won't go into all of the other bullet points, but you can see it's really important to have that social value come alongside it, rather than just talk about infrastructure, which a lot of people just glaze over when you do. So yeah, it's all about being part of the journey. I think that was it from memory.
Great. Well, thank you, David. That's a really, really impressive and comprehensive program. We've got about 20 minutes or so now for comments and questions. Can I also encourage everyone who's taking part in the audience to share in chat, not just questions, but also examples you think might be useful to others here, in perhaps other contracting or concession approaches like the one David just shared, other perhaps surprising things cities are doing which are worth learning from. as well as some, what are challenges and difficulties. And we'll maybe come back in a little bit to, David mentioned it, and Marika, this question of skills, how do we ensure at least that isn't one of the bottlenecks. But can I ask all of you a quick starting question? In a way, perhaps understandably, you've each emphasized the things which cities control in relation to areas like housing, energy, and transport, but none of you have said very much at all about behavior change. And one thing which has been a field of a lot of spending in the last 20 years are attempts to use incentives to get people to retrofit their homes or behave differently. Have we just assumed that these don't work very well? They're a bit inefficient, they're very costly. In Northern Ireland, for example, the government pretty much fell over one of those schemes. But what would you say on that? Maybe Marika, you might start.
Yeah, I think this might be different per country, but we've had quite an impact on our electricity and gas and the prices of energy in general by the war in Ukraine. So what we've actually seen is that nationally, there used to be a subsidy for solar panels, but we actually proposed to stop that because there are now so many solar panels, we don't actually need to motivate people anymore because there's almost like too much of them. So also what we saw in the city here, like despite campaigns that we may have already had in the past, especially in low-income neighborhoods, the war and the energy prices particularly have made people aware of how important it can be for them, for their wallet, basically, to have sustainable energy. So in these neighborhoods, you see people who don't even have a roof putting a solar panel on the shutters or like on places that you, in terms of security, wouldn't want them, but just because they think at least this way I'll reduce my bill. So that's had a huge impact when it comes to behavior and also making people aware where their energy comes from, and maybe it wasn't the motivation you would want, but in the end it has actually had quite an effect also on homeowners more generally.
Thanks, Marika. And going back to maybe Camilla and to Troels, any comment on the public behavior change, voluntary shift part of this equation? I was once in a discussion, actually not that long ago, chaired by the Dutch Prime Minister, Mark Rutte, with a number of other prime ministers, and they all thought these kind of incentive schemes had failed, that they didn't know how to get them to work. But any comment on that? And then I might ask Thomas, who's put a comment in the chat. Maybe you might share with us what you think the biggest surprises of the last 5 or 10 years have been. The things maybe we thought would work, which didn't, or vice versa. But first, Troels, over to you.
Yeah, I think the overall market and pricing of carbon dioxide will be instrumental in changing people's habits. And as long as we don't do this at national level, it's going to be difficult. A few things we are doing in Copenhagen, which has an effect, is, for example, we have implemented in quite high degree in our canteens and catering in the municipality that we have vegetables, much more vegetables, much less meat. And this has an effect. We can see that people get into the habit of eating less meat, for example, which is one of the biggest contributors to emissions. And we are thinking a lot of this in Copenhagen because we are the biggest municipality in Denmark and can set a trend. And it's also about driving the market, as you were talking about. We can use our buying power to, when we make tenders, we can drive the market in a direction.
So will we see meat-free cities? Which will be the first?
We are working on it.
And your bacon producers, maybe
they are not happy now.
They're not happy with that. Camilla, any comment from you on this topic?
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, I guess this goes a little bit back to the equity piece that I spoke a bit about. But when we look at climate action plans of cities, it does tend to be a much greater focus on people than you see at the kind of high level abstract country level. So I think you're right that there is a greater, I mean, there is a big focus firstly on people, but then we don't really see much on behavior change. And I think it is something to be thought about, and certainly something that my colleagues at Oxford Net Zero are taking quite seriously and doing some research into. But yeah, I think there's a lot more to be done, but it could in fact be, as I've said, the lack of reporting on how things are going. Yeah.
Thanks, Camilla. So I don't know, Thomas, if we could ask for a comment from you. The Net Zero Cities project across Europe, which has, I think, 100 cities, or now I think others are joining as well, is a huge program to try and speed up, as you say, learning. Is anything you would share about what the surprises are from that? What's coming up which might not have been expected 3, 4, 5 years ago?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Jeffrey, and good to see everyone here. I'm glad I was able to join the call and sort of listen in and to some of our cities talk about some of the experiences they're having. And maybe just for everyone's benefit, and I put a link to the website for people to chase up more information. But last year, the Commission launched the mission and sought expressions of interest from cities and selected 112 from the EU as well as associated countries. So Bristol, as an example, is one of those. Sorry, my phone is inappropriately chosen to chime in. Let me turn it off. Sorry. And so we've been working over the last 9 months with 112 cities, developing a platform to support them and looking at a variety of tools to help them in the process. Just to respond to your question, Jeff, I think the things I would observe is, we've seen over the last decade a remarkable change in market prices for distributed renewable technology. I think it's gone far faster and outstripped what most people would have gauged. What we have not seen is a level of regulatory reform and innovation around business models to enable that to have the scale effects that it needs, as well as to potentially open doors to different kinds of capital that could produce more economic benefits to communities and customers, and not just to investors who already have access to those business models. And there's a lot of work to be done there. I think social innovation and behavior has a role to play, but it's not the only role. It really takes multi-level governance down to the community level and up to the national government level to really make that happen. And I think that's an area where we could expect more progress. Let me just stop there because it's your show.
Thank you, Thomas. And I would encourage everyone to look at the Net Zero Cities website, which has loads of content and frameworks as well. And we got a number of questions in the chat and people who are involved in the local practical side asking questions. 2 issues I just wanted to raise, which are sort of tangential ones, but not that tangential. So one is the data question, which is mentioned in the chat. At the moment, for example, where I live, I cannot get any data on energy patterns, energy use in my area, because it's owned by an electricity company and they have no legal obligation to share it. So essentially, I think we're slightly flying blind on data, but any comments on that would be good. Obviously, Camilla, you've got a lot of great data sources, but where might we go in the next 5 or 10 years? And the other is governance. I think in Belgium, Leuven has created an interesting governance approach with 4 sectors sharing governance of net zero. And a couple of months ago, Brussels created a permanent citizens' assembly on climate change. Where else, again, any other comments on what we might see in terms of governance innovations to try and link in the community, business, in the Leuven case, I think universities as well, to help us? Who would like to comment on either of those? Marika, Are you copying they're not that far away from you, Brussels and Leuven, or is the governance kind of working for you?
Yeah, I forgot the name, that how you called it, like the citizens' input on climate. We will start that later this year, and we're now preparing this idea. So that will start also here in Rotterdam. And what I was thinking of in terms of governance, what I find quite interesting is that you see that a lot of the measures, homeowners usually they do take them because they have quite a direct link to their house, and like insulating it, solar panels will be theirs, etc. But what now in the south of Rotterdam, which is known throughout the country as a low income area, but also more generally it has a lot of challenges. And there they've actually started now a citizens cooperation, like I mentioned before, where you as a citizen can become part of this cooperation, even though you don't have a roof on which you can have the solar panel. You can still buy a share, and then the share will both give you some money, but that's not the main motivation. It also will do projects in the area to improve the part of the city. It can be making it greener or whatever you choose as a corporation to do. And I think those are quite interesting models of also involving citizens, especially those who themselves don't have the investment capacity or otherwise have the ability to make changes. Because I think one of the challenges is also that often those who can afford it make bigger changes, but it's not affordable for everyone. And so that's I think also a challenge when it comes to behavior, and also in terms of governance, not being just a city, but also the citizens themselves taking it in their own hands.
David, have you got anything to share on this space from Bristol? How are you bringing in the citizens to co-own your very ambitious plans? And does anything need to change with governance? Bristol's a city which has actually changed its overall governance quite a bit in quite a complicated dynamic in recent years.
Indeed, about to change again, I believe. So, I mean, we've certainly had a citizens' assembly which has considered a number of topics, which has fed into policy, and certainly climate change was one of them. So I think that's been reflected. It wasn't an area that I was working on, so I'm going to be slightly careful what I say. But I think that fed into our One City climate strategy, and there are sort of One City boards which bring together actors from across the city to be involved in a number of challenges across the city, so health and well-being, environment, so on and so forth. And certainly we've tried to reflect that when we've gone ahead and set up City Leap. We will have a community forum where there will be input and a chance to comment on the plans that we have. And as I mentioned in the presentation, putting a community energy fund in place to enable the community to have some ownership. It's really important that people feel they have a say and can play a part and have some ownership of the assets, actually. When we go ahead and make what is a societal shift. I mean, it's a huge change to move away from the energy system we've been using for the past 50, 100 years or so. So it's really important that people have a voice.
Thanks, David. I'll turn to Trolls, and then maybe in our last few minutes, if anyone wants to comment on where we started the session, and maybe Roland Harwood, you might comment on this. You put a couple of things in the chat. Where do we most need hard evidence or experiment or data? What are the things we most need to know which we don't really know about action in the next 10 or 20 years? But first, Trolls, over to you.
Yeah, habits and habit change. I think that getting the citizens involved are quite important in regard to that. What we see in Copenhagen, for example, is car ownership still grows in Copenhagen, even though we have built new metro, which is works quite well. So how do we stop that? How do we stop the growth in private ownership of cars in Copenhagen? We use a lot of citizen assembly, and we'll use it more and more, not only as an overall on a climate assembly, but also neighborhood by neighborhood. What do you want to do in this neighborhood? What kind of plans should we put in place? And our experience is when you let the citizens participate in this deliberation, they are as ambitious as the most green politicians. And you hear car owners who say, yes, let's have less space for cars and more space for trees and humans. And that's great. And I think it's an important tool in Copenhagen, and we will use much more the coming years.
And are you going to copy Oslo, which has made a huge bet on electric cars as part of the answer, or is that not the right route to go?
No, obviously we want. I mean, because one thing is the pollution and the carbon dioxide, but the other thing in Copenhagen is that we don't. It's the biggest fight in Copenhagen is about space. That's the biggest battle going on in the city, political in many ways. Are there space for a new football field?
Right.
Or should we build a retirement home? It's space that is the problem. So in that regard, we don't want a lot of electric cars. Yes, we want all the cars to be electric, but we don't want a lot.
Yeah, and one of the promises of a net zero city is you don't need you don't need masses of car parking space, huge roads, and so on. That's in a way for a generation or two from now, the plausible, rather attractive vision of future cities. In our final couple of minutes, Henriette or Jeremy, is any final comment you would like to make? Or requests of anyone on the call? And any final comment from our speakers, Camilla, Marika, David, on either things you would like to know, either evidence questions or any other observations before we finish? Maybe Camilla first.
Yeah, just maybe to come back to the data question. One of the things that we really see at the tracker is that cities aren't sharing what they're doing in terms of net zero. And we know that they're doing a lot. I mean, we've heard a lot on this call. But I think it's only a couple of cities that are really kind of showing exactly where they're going and the steps that they're taking. And that's useful not just for people living in those cities, but also for other cities around the world to see what's working, what's not. So I guess that's one thing where I really think that we could see some movement.
Fantastic. Marika?
Yeah, I think I was looking at the data of Rotterdam and also the national data that is provided, and indeed I cannot even find reliable data on wind power and then solar energy in our city. So I would agree there, and I think that's going to be one of my questions to the alderman after the city, like where can we actually start reporting a bit better, because the criticism is that we don't do enough, but indeed we do a lot more than is visible now.
Troels, a final comment from you?
Yeah, data is really important, and one of the new things in Copenhagen is we are trying to implement some aspects of donut economics in tracking other things than the emissions, and to be a part of the overall reporting in the city in how we are doing.
And David?
Yeah, I agree. In terms of trying to plan strategically, the absence of data at city level is actually really challenging. Trying to understand where constraints are on the system and where we're going to run into problems as we do electrification of transport and vehicles, when we kind of will run into those buffers as we go. That's not a good place to be. So yeah, a joined up conversation. I think someone did mention the grid constraints earlier. They are very real. And that's, that needs to be a national policy in terms of driving grid capacity to support mass electrification of so many things that currently aren't.
Thank you. Look, thank you very much, all of you, for your comments. We promised we would finish a few minutes before the hour, so you have time to do whatever you need to do before our next meeting. This has been a really good conversation and really specific and concrete, which is what we wanted rather than so rhetorical and generic. We will be doing a lot of work in this space over the course of this year, both working with national governments, but also with cities, and trying to get as specific as possible about where there is evidence, where there isn't evidence, what more can be done to orchestrate it and make it useful. We haven't talked, I'm afraid, at all really about the skills issues which several of you raised, and how do you know, what does a really good skill strategy look like which can overcome those bottlenecks and constraints. But maybe this is a topic we might return to in the near future, Jeremy and Henriette. And again, do look at the background papers, do comment on what's missing from them. And we've had lots of very helpful links put in the chat, which we will absorb into their next iterations. So thank you all very much. This is obviously a very ongoing process. And thank you all for the amazing work you're doing, as well as for being with us today.